Hello, my name is Mark Langdale. I'm president of the George W. Bush Foundation. I want to welcome you here to our final panel of a great event that we're having today with the National Archives and Records Administration. In my job, I get asked a lot, well, how do you get the chance to work on building something as interesting and significant as the George W. Bush Presidential Center? And I go, well, I have experience building complex real estate projects. I served in government. I'm interested in presidential history. I even like to watch C-SPAN 3. But the big reason and the real reason that I have this really great job is 23 years ago, George and Laura Bush moved to Dallas, Texas, and they bought the house next door to me. And we became friends. And if there's one thing I can testify to that's true then and is true today, is that George and Laura Bush are true partners in life, and George W. Bush truly and deeply loves his wife. So it is an honor for me to introduce to you a man who truly and deeply loves his wife, the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you all for coming. So it seems fitting to me that for the America's First Ladies Conference, we actually have First Ladies. And it's my honor to introduce them. Before I do so, I want to thank Mark Langdale for his leadership of the George W. Bush Foundation. I want to thank Anita McBride for conceiving and chairing what has been a really fascinating discussion. I actually watched some of it being streamed over the internet. I want to thank Gerald Turner of SMU and the SMU folks. SMU is an awesome university, by the way, and we are honored to be associated with it. And Neil Kerwin, president of American University, and his wife Ann have joined us. Thank you so much for being here. I want to thank the library directors. Alan Lowe, of course, of the Bush President 43. Warren Finch, Bush President 41. And look, I'll be the funny guy. And Mark Updegrove of Lyndon Baines Johnson's library right down the road. So, first of all, I want to say something about Doris Kearns Goodwin. We're fortunate to have her here. She's an awesome historian. She really is. She wrote, I read a lot of history when I was president. I can just hear people saying, we paid you all that money and all you did was sit around reading. It was fascinating. Well, I didn't watch much TV. Anyway, it was fascinating to read history while I had the honor of making history. And no better historian to help a president understand the past and the future, by the way, than Doris Kearns Goodwin. So we're honored you're here. And so the other thing that impressed me about Doris Kearns Goodwin is she raised a son who became a United States Marine, volunteered to be a United States Marine after September the 11th. I have the honor of introducing the best First Lady ever. Mom, would you take a tie? Obviously, I don't mind being surrounded by strong women. I was raised by one, I married one, and I believe we're raising two. Welcome, former First Ladies, Barbara and Laura Bush.
Thank you very much. I thought he'd leave. Well, for me, this is such a great honor. Can you imagine having spent my life trying to bring presidents and first ladies who are no longer alive to life? I've got live ones here. Much more fun.
We hope.
I always worry that I worry that I worry that someday I worry that someday in the afterlife there'll be a panel of all the presidents I've ever studied, and everybody will tell me every single thing I got wrong. The first person to yell out will be LBJ. How come that damn book on the Kennedys was twice as long as the book about me? But let me begin, because I love to tell stories from the beginning, with what it was like when you first get to the White House. You have this great line where you said, I woke up with the president-elect. What's it like to wake up with the president in the morning and know that he's president, and know that you're in a place that has 132 rooms and you have to make it a home? How do you do that?
Well, the house really, I think, was very easy. We brought furniture for the one family room, which was beautiful. And our own curtains came, matched the couches that we brought. First of all, the 90-some people who work for you are family. They really are. And when we went back all those years later, 8 years later, when George and Laura were there was our family. They were still there. And there's some of them still there, not many anymore. Old age got them.
Did you have a favorite place in the White House where you liked to go?
Well, I loved my little office because it was, besides being Nancy Reagan's beauty parlor, which she didn't like me to say, but it was. And the dogs were born there, and you could look out the window at Jackson Place and what's that park?
Lafayette Square.
Lafayette Square, and you could see all sorts of wonderful things. Now, nobody else faced that part of Washington, but I saw more people protesting us and some people who loved us. And I saw people, weddings, they would back up and have a wedding picture taken.
Oh, wow.
I saw my first black bridesmaids' dresses backing up to have their picture taken by the White House. I mean, their dresses were black, which I thought was amazing. But I loved looking out at the people.
I can well imagine. How about you? How did you go about that? I mean, you'd already been there, of course.
I'd already been there. I had a huge advantage that no one else, I guess, except Louisa Adams had, and that is because I'd been there so often. And I knew already from having been there with Barr and with my father-in-law, President Bush, that it really is a home. And I knew Barr had made it into a home. It was a home where our little girls, when they were 7, when their grandfather was president, could slide down the ramp from the conservatory, the solarium that you saw in several of the photos earlier, the wooden ramp, slide down that on their bottom, or make the running jump to the one big antique bed that was so tall that it required steps to get into, but Barbara and Jenna could run and jump on it at that age. They also, when the Obamas came for the tour, they showed Sasha and Malia all of those tricks from their childhood at the White House, sliding down the ramp and jumping on the beds. So I really knew, and because I knew that there was this really magnificent collection of White House furniture, I didn't move anything with us. We had just moved into our ranch house, which is where all our furniture went. So I brought one chest of drawers for my dressing room that was George's grandmother's, just to have that there, just to remember her. And then I brought some of our books, a few of our books. I also knew that we would get lots of books, and so I didn't bring our whole library. And just brought personal photographs, and then had a wonderful time going to the big warehouse. You can't call it a warehouse because it's really climate and temperature control with a conservator. Storage space where all the White House furniture was, and bringing back different pieces to the White House.
To what extent are you aware of other presidents and their first wives and the first ladies being in different rooms?
I think there's a place in the White House which later became closets, I think, for ladies' clothes. That's where I hung my evening clothes and things. That if you walk down, looking out at Lafayette Square, where presidents made great pronouncements to people, and we brought a historian up, Lincoln historian up, and he said, I just can't believe I'm here. Now, granted, they'd redone the White House but he felt he knew it. So he went right to the closet, down the corridor, and I think the girls' rooms opened off
on
there.
both sides.
But he ran right down there and looked, and there wasn't the portico or something there, and he could feel Lincoln giving the speech.
Wow.
And it was
I can imagine that.
Very exciting with him. One thing I forgot to mention, the thing I loved most was I could hear Jenna and Barbara, and I could hear Marshall and Walker giggling and laughing and riding bikes and swimming and who knew what. But anyway, and George loved that. They would swim and then they'd come into and Neil's children. But they lived in Washington, Doro's children, and Jenna and Barbara would come. They all came to visit, but it was so cute. You could hear that it made it home, and you heard.
Imagine that.
And besides that, when your own house, when your grandchildren come, you work. When they come to the White House, there are 92 people who will take care of it.
So when did you think of restoring the Lincoln Room, speaking of Lincoln, since I was able to see that, and you just did an amazing job.
Well, you do think of presidents the whole time you're there, and there's a great comfort in that because you think of all the other challenges that other presidents faced and that our country faced and how we overcame all of those challenges, and especially in a time when we had troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was very comforting after September 11th to know that we can overcome this too, and that we'll move on. And while peace may not be forever, neither is war. And there's a great continuity, really, of living in a house where all the presidents, every one of them, except for George Washington, had lived before you. And one of the things you do when you live there is you live with these effects of all the people that lived there before you. You live with their decorating. You live with their taste, their choice in furniture or in china or in decorative arts, all the things that were acquired by the White House during other terms. And slowly, I moved different pieces from the storage and set up each room. And then at one point during the second term, we determined that it was time to redo the Lincoln bedroom. It had last been done during President Ford, I believe. Actually, it was set up as a bedroom after Truman renovated the White House. The bed had actually been in a room that's now the upstairs dining room across the hall from the presidential bedrooms. The room that's now set up as the Lincoln bedroom was Lincoln's office. Before the West Wing was built, obviously all the offices were down at that end of the residence hall. And it was the room that Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation in. We owned one of the 5 original copies of the Gettysburg Address written in Lincoln's hand, and that was in the room. And our guests who would come stay in the Lincoln bedroom would look at that copy of the Gettysburg Address and read it and weep. It was very, very moving to see it. And so I worked with the White House Historical Association with the furniture curators and historians that are part of the advisory board, and we had a little remnant of the wallpaper that had been on the wall of his room. We had photographs of the Lincoln bed with a gold corona with purple and gold drapes that hung down from the corona. We knew from White House records that the corona had been sent away from the White House in 1927. So we reproduced all those things. So it's not a real reproduction because it's neither an office or a bedroom, but instead both. We went back to the same mill in England that had run the carpet for him on the 27-inch
Wow.
loom. And we knew from the records that the carpet was G&O, which the curators think meant green and oak, green and brown. And we went to the same mill, and they didn't have records of what they'd actually sold to the White House, but we used a pattern that we think was the pattern. So it was really very, very fun. It's a great way to...
I remember seeing it was so exciting. Just to know that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in that very room. There's actually a great story. He had shaken so many hands that morning on New Year's morning that when he went to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, his own hand was numb and shaking. He put the pen down. He said, "If ever my soul were in an act, it is in this act. And if I sign with a shaking hand, posterity will say he hesitated." So he waited and waited until he could sign, and it's a really big, bold hand for him.
Abraham Lincoln.
No, it's great.
Do you remember the first guest of the Bush family who stayed in that bed? And we immediately sent a new mattress for the Lincoln bed.
Bucky
it was the
and
most
Patty,
uncomfortable bed. Maybe historic, but it was. Bucky and Patty bought a new.
I think it was Bucky.
Our brother and sister-in-law said nobody could sleep on this bed.
I'll never forget one night I was able to sleep in what was Churchill's room, and there was no way I could
Queen's
sleep. I was
bedroom.
certain he was sitting in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking
cigar.
a cigar. In fact, that bedroom is the scene of a favorite story in World War II. When Churchill came there right after Pearl Harbor, he and Roosevelt were supposed to sign this document putting the Allied nations against the Axis powers, but Roosevelt awakened that morning not liking the word Associated Nations, which is what they were calling themselves, so he wanted to call them the United Nations. Comes wheeling into Churchill's bedroom to tell him the news, but Churchill's just coming out of the bathtub and has nothing on. So Roosevelt said, "I'm so sorry, I'll come back in a few moments," but Churchill, ever able to speak in a very formal voice, said, "Oh no, please stay. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President." So anyway, speaking of Churchill sticking his stomach out, I recognize there's no regular ritual day in the White House, but what amazed me about you was, number one, the athleticism of you. Number two, that you wrote a diary. We historians are so sad to think that in the future, 200 years from now, people are not going to have diaries. It's my favorite treasure. Did you have a regular time when you wrote in the diary?
I just wake up very early. I woke up at 6 this morning. I wake up very early.
And lively? You wake up lively?
I don't talk to anybody. No, I wake up, put the dogs out, get the coffee, pick up the paper. But in those days, I really woke up pretty lively. And I had just learned how to use a computer. And I wrote a diary, and actually John Meacham has been given permission only, because not to be open for 50 years, because I'm pretty
Frank.
naughty. Frank's a good one. Anyway,
Who would guess?
so, not to my precious daughter. Anyway, I wrote a diary, and he's allowed to read part of it. But I'm ashamed to say I did not write too much about we have a war going on. I really wrote more about I don't know what. I haven't read my diary in years. It's in the library, and anyone who reads it other than John Meacham, just a certain number of years, will be shot.
Oh. Well, I guess as an historian, I'm not going to be reading that.
Well, Barr is so unbelievably disciplined. It takes a lot of discipline to write a diary, and then she would go to the White House swimming pool and swim laps every morning.
Now I can't. Since I have new knees, they sink. I'm in real trouble.
What fun it must have been to live with you. Wow.
I don't know if George thinks that.
I think he does. So speaking of routines of the day, when I read your memoir, the funniest thing was when you talked about, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, your nightly routine. Could you tell these people about that? I loved it so.
Well, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, you've probably seen it every year on television, but it's the evening when all the White House correspondents, the press that are assigned to the White House, and their guests, and they always try to out-celebrity each other and invite lots of celebrities, come to roast the president. As George said, everyone makes fun of the president, and he stands up and makes fun of himself. So George was always very funny at every one of the White House Correspondents' Dinners, but finally he said, "I've run out of ideas. Why don't you surprise everyone and speak?" And so I had a very funny speech, I think, and George got up and to speak to the crowd and kind of laughed and said, started telling a joke, and I sprang up and pushed him out of the way and said, no, not that old joke again. And people gasped. I mean, the people I was sitting with thought that I really had just jumped up. But anyway, then I talked about being a desperate housewife and how Mr. Excitement here was already in bed at 9:30. And I said that one night Lynn Cheney and Condi Rice and Karen Hughes, who I think is here, and I had gone to Chippendales. And I wouldn't even have mentioned it except Sandra Day O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg saw us there. But, that sort of humor doesn't really translate to most countries, because most countries you can't roast the president like that. And so for a year after that, at least, on foreign travel, heads of state, when we were somewhere else, would take me aside and say, "Are you really a desperate housewife?"
Humor is such an important
Those
thing.
things sometimes backfire.
Yeah,
I can't
exactly.
remember which dinner, but there's a white tie dinner.
The
where-
gridiron.
The gridiron, where they take themselves, so seriously, you press. But anyway, I decided it was on April 1st, and I thought, aha. So I worked with my hairdresser, and I wore a red wig and came out in my evening dress, and George says, "You're not going like that, are you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." So we went to the dinner, and some people thought I had cancer. And some people said, "Who is that woman with the president?" And nobody thought it was funny. I'd gone to great trouble to get this wonderful wig. Anyway, it backfired. People were saying, "How are you?" for days after that.
And you were just fine. To what extent do the First Ladies get involved in preparing the meals or the menus that are going to be eaten just for your ordinary nights?
None.
Ordinary night, no. But the state dinners, they give you choices of different menus, and actually everything they cooked was so good. I do wish I was with there
Yeah,
again.
exactly.
Only for the meals. But
We did have tastings for state
Yes.
dinners. We usually invited congressmen who weren't going to be invited to the state dinner over for the
you see, you were much
to
smarter
be the
than we
guinea
were.
pigs. But the White House chef would give us a weekly menu, and so if there was something on there we didn't think we'd want, we would call and say, "Don't fix that." But they were pretty terrific.
They were unbelievable food.
You know,
That's who we
and
really
lovely
miss.
people.
I can imagine. One of the things I remember, of course, that your husband didn't like broccoli, and that became a famous moment. Do you know that FDR hated broccoli too?
Oh, good.
And his chef at the White House, who was a woman, and she was really tough,
Oh, I
would
think I read
constantly
that.
serve him broccoli because he should eat it, even if he didn't like
I
it.
read that in your book. I
Yeah,
think.
exactly.
I did.
And then every morning she served him oatmeal every single morning. He finally cut out cornflakes, 19 cents. Post Toasties, 20 cents. Couldn't I have something other than oatmeal? And then finally he said he was getting chicken 6 nights a week, and his stomach was rebelling so much that he bit a foreign power. So Texas is so fortunate to have had 3 First Ladies in recent history. Tell me about your feelings about Lady Bird Johnson, who I had such enormous respect for, and so lucky to have known her when I was 24 years old.
We adored her, truthfully, both George and I. And I felt so badly, and probably shouldn't say this, but when we went to Washington, I was so offended by the attitude of the Kennedy people who would say to you, "Oh, I wish you'd been here in the good times, instead of these awful Texans." And finally, at a dinner one night, I said, "You know, I'm a Texan." And they said, "No, you're not. You're from the East." I said, "Well, then my 5 children are." And we stopped doing that. We stopped going to those dinners. But they ridiculed her accent. She was the most wonderful lady. She did more for beauty in this country. And she was so generous and genuine, and I loved her. And until Laura, she was my favorite First Lady.
I also really admired her, and I was at graduate school at Texas when President Johnson died, and his body lay in state at the LBJ Library, and I lined up, and they were there, Lady Bird and Linda and Lucy, greeting every single person that came through. But I did get to take her on a tour of the White House. The last time she came to the White House, Linda brought her, and she was in a wheelchair, and she'd lost her speech by then from a stroke, but she was still so expressive with her hands. If she saw a painting, I showed her President Johnson's painting again, and she sort of put her arms out to him. And when we met her at the door, the doorman had been the maitre d', come back in retirement to be the doorman, but he'd been the maitre d' when the Johnsons were there, and he just sort of fell into her arms, and they hugged. And so it was really a wonderful pleasure to get to show her the White House that last time.
She came to the White House when we were there, too. She told a story about that picture of the little grumpy girl.
Thomas Akins.
Yeah, that's right. And the group standing, looking at it, and someone said, maybe Lady Bird said, "Isn't she grumpy?" And a voice in the back said, "She wasn't always. I married her later." But you know the picture, the little grumpy girl.
You know, what it shows is when we often talk about First Ladies, and I'd like to talk about that in a minute, we talk about what they've done as First Ladies, and both of you did so much on literacy and reading. But the relationship with the president is such an important thing. I mean, she was able to calm. LBJ was such a character. He'd go off at times. She could just put her hand on his knee. "Now, Lyndon, you don't really mean that." And there was just an ease that came into her. And that relationship of whatever you do in your marriage, in your life, in your partnership, that's the real power, I think, that besides all the things you do in the world at large. But let's start with you and literacy. I mean, I know what you've done, and how did it happen that you chose that to...
Well, I jogged around Memorial Park one year, knowing George was going to run. Now, granted, nobody else thought he was, but anyway, I've tried to think of something. I'd worked in hospitals, always, as a volunteer, and then I decided I should do something that helped the most people and cost the government less money. I didn't want to be controversial. I got problems with that anyway, so I wanted to keep it down. But it comes naturally. But I picked literacy because there's just no question in my mind. And now I've gone into family literacy, because if you have a mother or father or caretaker who can read, they can then follow their child in school and help them. If they can't, then the child doesn't have any inspiration. And the statistics in our country are shocking. The number of children who do not graduate from high school and who just drop out of the system. And so we're working very hard still. I have turned my foundation over. They don't seem to take it as well as they should, but Jeb and Doro are doing nationally, and Neil and Maria, who's here, are doing Texas, and George P. and Mandy under them are doing Fort Worth and Dallas. But they keep saying, "Oh, Mom, just sign this letter." And I'm glad to do that, but I want them to take over. I'm 80, almost 87, and I'm delighted to be here, but George needs me. He needs me. His legs have said no more, will not move, and it makes a huge difference. And what's more, I am loving having him to myself. I'm loving him. Yeah, about time, says his cousin. But he's wonderful, he's loving and sweet, and he adores it. The children are all great. Neil and Maria live across the street, which is certainly something I never would have done. She built a house across the street from us. I loved my mother-in-law. I would no more have lived within 6 blocks of her than some. But their children come by, and it's just great. So we love our life. We have a lot of good friends. And he needs me.
Wow. So reading for you, the book festivals, and eventually Afghanistan and Burma, and speaking. I remember once you said you never thought you'd have to give a speech, or you promised. Look at you now.
I didn't go so much as Barr did, thinking one specific topic, just because I'd been First Lady of Texas and worked on a number of issues, including, of course, education. George had run on education as a campaign, policy issue that he campaigned on. So I knew we would spend a lot of time on education. I hoped we would. And because I'd started the Texas Book Festival when we were in Austin, it just seemed a natural. And actually, James Billington, the Library of Congress, came straight to me as soon as George was elected. And then the very first day that we lived there, I walked downstairs and saw Dick Moe, who was the head of the National Trust on Historic Preservation, on his way across the downstairs cross hall toward the West Wing to meet with George. And I told him that I wanted to continue to work on Save America's Treasures, which Hillary Clinton had started when she was First Lady before me, just because of my interest in historical preservation. And so and then I think things just sort of presented themselves. And obviously women's rights and women's issues became very important as everyone in the world really turned to look at Afghanistan and saw how women were treated there. And I think American women were really horrified. The idea of a government that would forbid half of their population from being educated was really shocking to us. And I noticed, I could tell that American women really felt a very strong sense of sisterhood with women in Afghanistan and wanted to do whatever they could to help. And so, you know, a lot of other things too as well.
I wish they'd showed that picture of you with all the Saudi Arabian ladies.
Yeah, that was
When you went, they had no idea about cancer and women's.
breast cancer. Yeah,
I mean, you did 100 things.
I did a lot of things.
It must be
But
an extraordinary feeling to know that you have a pulpit and you can use it to make a difference.
Well, I knew that obviously from watching Barr and from Lady Bird's famous line about the First Lady has a podium, and she said for herself, and I choose to use it. But I don't think you really, you know it intellectually, but you don't maybe really understand it emotionally. When I gave the radio address about the Taliban, and right after that, we were at our ranch when Susan was talking about the photographs when I was giving the radio address, and then I went into Austin, and Jenna was in college, a freshman in college in Austin, and I went in to see her and went shopping with her at a department store, and the women selling the cosmetics said, "Thank you so much for speaking for the women of Afghanistan." And that's really when I understood that people really did listen to the First Lady, and that, you know, they really did hear me. And
You did a lot, though, in Africa with AIDS and with that she and George had the most extraordinary reach for helping others. There are more little George Bushes in Africa than you can shake a stick at. We think they're after your father, of course, but we know they're not. But he also, I mean, they did things for ailments that were curable. I mean, you ought to talk about that because you really did.
well, and that was one of the things that was really very lucky for me is I got to, George would make the policy with his side. A lot of times I got credit for it, even though, because no one wanted to give George credit, but it would really be his policy issues. But then I could travel for those policy issues. So I went to Africa 5 times, 2 times with George, the first time and the last time, and then while George was president. We just went again, as you all probably, many of you know, because the Bush Institute just announced our Global Health Initiative in last fall, and then in early December, George and Barbara and Jenna and Henry and I went to Africa for George to speak at the International Conference on AIDS in Africa in Ethiopia, and announced our Global Health Initiative, which is adding the testing, treatment, and vaccine for cervical cancer to the PEPFAR platform that was already set up, the AIDS platform already set up.
Well, and you did something for malaria, too.
And then President's Malaria Initiative, you know, a lot of things.
I shouldn't have to be prompting you
Thank
on
you
this.
for prompting me, Bart.
You know, Lincoln once said that one of the great things about the sort of the regular routine of the White House being so demanding was that you didn't have time if you got mad at somebody to keep it up. That you just, you know, he said, I just have sufficient time for a temper. Was that true? If hurtful things were done or there were things bad happening outside, were you able to just put them aside, or did they hurt?
No, I mean, you know, of course you didn't like to have your husband be criticized, but I knew from the way the election was in 1992 that what happens in the United States is that our presidents and our first ladies, for that matter, get characterized in a way that they're not a lot of times. And George and I were so miserable in 1992 when President Bush lost. It was really terrible for us to see our father, who we loved, criticized in a way that we thought was unfair. And so I was very aware that that's just part of it. And that's just something you put up with. And you do, and you're right, you're so busy, and there's so many issues, and there's so many things you're working on. Plus, you know a lot of times better than the people that are criticizing you. I mean, you really do. You know more about the issue than they're, you know, it's easy to stand from the back row and criticize without really being as informed, obviously, as someone who's briefed every day is. And so I think you are too busy to spend a lot of time on it. I will have to admit, I love to call Bar and commiserate about certain reporters.
Who will remain nameless.
That's right.
But you know, speaking of 92, when we lost, and our children all went away because they couldn't bear to go through the thing, we went home, and we went home on the plane with many friends, which was great, and we loved that. And I really should mention the day we got elected, Jenna and Barbara plugged Air Force One's toilet, but other than that, they were young. But anyway, we went home, and I felt terrible for George, but there was a great welcome. But while driving home, there was a beaten-up truck, people standing on it with a great big banner that said, "Welcome home, George and Barbara." And we were home.
And you were home.
That made it okay. I'm going to weep over it, but it made it okay. And we have loved being home. I probably more than George. Jimmy Baker and Susan are as close friends as he has, but his friends are dropping off a little faster than they should, passing on. And I have a lot of friends there that I really love. And for the first time in my life, I even work in the church on Monday morning, doing kneelers, meeting new people, and they're so great. I mean, they do prison. They go to the prisons. They do Under the Bridge, which was the homeless. They feed them. They're the most wonderful people. I've had a great time with friends.
I loved what you said in your memoir after it was over. You said, "Hooray, life after politics," which is one of the extraordinary things about our country, that one day you are the president and the first lady living in this mansion, the most powerful people in the world, and the next day you're private citizens, and it's a miracle that happens here. And in so many other countries in the world, it doesn't happen.
Well, in
it's
England,
great.
They're beaten and they're thrown out of number 10 the next day.
Right.
They're out. And that is not easy.
But you've been around a little while.
Come on. You don't have to be ugly.
So all I was going to ask you was, does it seem to you, as it does to me as an historian, that times are coarser in terms of critiques today? I mean, I'm sure maybe things, we were talking about this before, were terrible prior to the Civil War. You had a senator who was hit on the head with a cane and didn't recover for a couple of years. And yet there's something about the language, the negative attacks, the dysfunction of Washington now that I've never seen in my lifetime.
Never, ever. You don't have to be around long to see that. But it's been, I think, the worst campaign I've ever seen in my life. I just hate it. I hate the fact that people think compromise is a dirty word.
Right.
It is not a dirty word.
Absolutely.
You haven't been around long enough. You haven't been, but you can speak.
Well, I think, obviously I thought when George was being criticized that things were really worse than ever. But then we went to the Lincoln Library in Springfield with Richard and saw those terrible cartoons about Lincoln, and you realize it's just kind of a part of American politics. The great news is we do elect somebody, and they do serve for 4 years, and then if they're reelected, they get 4 more, and if they're not, they move out and somebody else moves in. And I think it's just an example for the rest of the world.
No.
You're much kinder than I. I think the rest of the world is looking at us and thinking, what are you doing? Why aren't you getting along? Why aren't you working together? I'm sort of sad that we're not doing better. You're much more optimistic than I.
No, I'm just more realistic.
I'm optimistic, but I would like this campaign to be over.
I think once upon a time when people stayed in Washington on the weekends before travel was easy, before they had to go home to raise the money for the ridiculous amounts that the elections caused, friendships were formed across party lines. They would play poker together.
That's
They'd
what
be together on
Cokie
weekends.
Roberts says. I don't know if Cokie's already left, but when she was a child and her parents were friends with people, because you lived there, and so you went to the Little League games together with your children, no matter what side of the aisle you are.
And now they run home on Thursday nights, and they come back on Tuesdays, and there's a real tribal sense of who's on what side. And
But we were great friends with Rostenkowski. George called him in jail, and Bob Strauss was a good friend. I mean, we had great friends that we really. But on the other hand, the press in those days did not. If a senator or a congressman fell under the table from drink, nobody mentioned it.
Right.
But today they're pretty tough.
No, I mean, I think about the fact when Franklin Roosevelt fell in 1936, coming to the Democratic Convention, and his braces unlocked, he fell on the floor, his speech sprawled out, and he said, "Get me together," and he gets up at the podium. He delivers a speech, which is one of the best speeches in history, and the press never mentioned that he'd fallen. There wasn't a picture of him falling. They just talked about the speech.
Well, I do think the press is part of the reason that it looks so acrimonious, because any little thing is repeated a million times.
Like 95%.
When before, nothing, you wouldn't have ever been repeated, or most people wouldn't have heard it.
There was a sense in those older days that the private lives of our public figures were relevant only if they affected their public responsibilities. So there was a certain kind of cushion of tolerance for people's lives to have some privacy. And that's what I worry about, whether people are going to be willing to enter public life now.
Why would they?
Yeah, because it's still, as you know, for all the difficulties, you wouldn't change it for the world, right?
No, except I think people would have a very hard time running for public office, for the presidency. These people they're exhausted, and it's acrimonious, if that's a word, and it's sad.
I mean, it used to be it would just be from September until November because you had the brokers at the conventions. Maybe that's what we need to go back to. Goodbye, primaries. Come back to those days. What extent does humor help to allay those difficulties? Like, for example, I know you had Dana Carvey to the White House. What a brilliant maneuver. So tell me how that happened.
George, the whole White House when we lost was in the dumps. I mean, nobody smiled. Bless their hearts, they were looking for jobs, and they had 3 months to do it in, and everybody was in the dumps. So George invited Dana Carvey to come. We went to, I think, the Kennedy Center honors the night before, and he sat way away. Nobody knew he was there, and stayed at the White House. And then we went down, George gathered everyone together, and they went, doodly-doo-doo-doo. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. In walks this tiny little funny man. And everybody, he was wonderful, and he imitated George and then introduced George, and George imitated him. It changed the whole feeling of it was so sad. Very sad. I mean, all looking for jobs and all in tears, but it cheered up. But George is very funny.
Yeah, I mean, I remember there's this one famous moment when somebody said to Lincoln, "You're two-faced," and he looked back and he said, "If I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this face?" I mean, if only you have to be, that seems missing in politics today, too, that sense of looking at yourself from the outside and then laughing.
He must have been a wonderful man.
Oh, I loved living with him. The most embarrassing thing is one time I was on Jon Stewart. I mean, I fell so in love with Lincoln that I said on Jon Stewart, I think he was really sexy, too. And that's not what you think of for Abraham Lincoln. But there's this picture of him before the beard when he had this real ragged hair, and he looked great. So after that, I could, you think Lincoln was sexy? So, okay, what do you think how do you memorize the things you need to memorize? You're in these state dinners. I know somebody tells you the name of the person when they come in, but you have to really remember stories about people. Do you cultivate memory? I mean, I know your husbands have to, but you must as well. Is it
I think it's it's a matter of concentration, and I think you get better at it for sure.
A good thing about being a woman is you can kiss a woman and a man. You may not know them, but they think you know them. Now, George could not kiss the men. But that works for me. Still, if I kissed you, you know I love you and know you. I don't know your name, but I love you.
Do you remember the story you told in your memoir about Helen Hayes? There's this great story of Helen Hayes talking about two old women at a bridge party. Mrs. Bush told this, and I remember. Do you want me to tell it?
Yeah, you tell it.
Okay. So anyway, they're at a bridge party, and the one old lady says, "Oh, I really liked playing bridge with you, but I'm so embarrassed. I've been playing for a while. I can't quite remember your name." So the other old lady says, "Could you give me a few minutes to try and think of what the name is?"
We're at that stage in our life.
So how hard is it to leave the White House? I mean, what is it like when you're going to Camp David for the last time? You're going to see the troops for the last time. Well, tell me about Camp David. I feel always so terrible. One time Lyndon Johnson invited me to go, and I went out with my stupid boyfriend to the movies instead.
Oh, no.
So I've never seen it. What is it? Why is it
We
so special?
loved Camp David. All the Bushes did. We went a lot when President 41 was president. We went for all 4 years for Christmas, and then they came with us for all 8 years for Christmas. So we have the record that I know will never be broken of the number of Christmases at Camp David. We love going there. It's so relaxed and lots of different sports, but a great place to entertain people. We had friends. A lot of our friends came every year at least once to camp with us, and everyone could just have their own cabin and meet for meals. It was very relaxing to have camp, I think.
You know, they put in Camp David a book, and they write the people who stayed up there. And I suspect that between us, because we're both married to very gregarious men, I guess, and they invite everybody they know. So when they got to the Bushes, and then you skip a thing, or before the Bushes, why, there's 2 or 3 guests, maybe. The Bushes are, every bedroom is filled, and that made it so much more fun, and sharing it with friends. But really, I think, and I'm sure George did too, my George got more work done at Camp David because we'd invite guests and we'd say, we'll see you at lunch. You can go play tennis, you can bowl, you can do whatever you want, but we'll see you at lunch. And George worked. I probably worked on my diary, but George worked and met with people, business people, and who could help you with problems. Did you do that? Yes.
Yes, Mom.
No, I think it was a great place. Nobody knew who was there. They could drive in and out, so you could meet without any problems.
Yeah, we used it a lot for entertaining heads of state and, cabinet members and Congress people that would come with us on various trips.
And there must have been a greater sense of just while you're in the confines of Camp David, you can roam around.
That's right. You can go for
I remember once,
long
I think
walks.
it was, somebody related to you once told me, is the windows in the White House not open, and you can open them at Camp David? Is that true?
We had some open.
You do have some open.
Yeah, but
We used
had
to open our bedroom.
We had the bedroom open. But I do remember when Gorbachev came, and Mrs. Gorbachev came out, and he was sort of like you've got on. And we walked. Oh, yes, I'm dying to walk. She had blisters beyond belief. And we put her into lower shoes later. But he stood up and, George, this is horseshoes? And George said yes. And he threw a
Ringer?
A ringer.
Wow.
The first one, the only one he shot. So George at dinner had it mounted with a thing.
Oh. It must have been an incredible thing to have Gorbachev there, having lived at the height of the Cold War, and here you've got this head of Russia there, and you become friends. I mean, that's a huge circle in our history.
They brought Putin to our house in Walker's Point, and we became great friends, but I think that's lost now.
Well, George's story that was so moving to us was how close Koizumi from Japan was as a friend, and one of the first to call after September 11th to offer his alliance with us when George's dad and Koizumi's dad had fought, had been sworn enemies with each other in World War II. And the idea that somebody who'd been an enemy that short of a time ago was one of our closest allies now is really amazing.
So how did things physically change in the White House after 9/11?
Well, right after 9/11, the tours stopped. We were really, the White House is one of the only, I think, homes of a head of state that's open for public tours. And but they stopped for a while. The White House booksellers used to sell their White House Historical Association books right in the White House, but now that doesn't happen anymore. I think people have to leave their purses and shopping bags and things outside.
Where do they buy the books now?
They have to go down the street where the White House Historical. And it was in the White House Historical Association are one of our partners in these conferences as well. And I think it did hurt their fundraising because they'd been able to sell a lot more from their gift shop when their gift shop could be in the White House. So the White House was very quiet. That very first Christmas of 2001, you know, we invited friends from all over to all the Christmas parties, and a lot of people didn't come. A lot of people were still afraid to fly.
Didn't come?
Didn't come.
Afraid to come.
Afraid
on
to
the
fly.
plane, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the street got closed. Was that when the street got
Pennsylvania
closed?
Avenue was already closed. Remember, it was closed when that plane flew into
That's
the
right.
White House when President Clinton was there. A little plane.
Well, is
flew
it
in.
closed now?
And it's closed now.
Oh, it's
What's
still.
is
And
that
so
on the
we were
backside
thinking
of the?
of opening it, and then that happened. And then we worked with Michael Van Valkenburg, the same landscape architect that's doing the Bush Library over here, doing the landscaping for it, to then landscape Pennsylvania Avenue so it didn't look like so much like a closed street. And
Is that the
afterwards.
one on the south lawn?
Pennsylvania Avenue. The South Street closes periodically, but it's not closed always.
Isn't it impossible
Easter.
to imagine that in Lincoln's time people could just walk into the White
Yeah,
House?
exactly.
They didn't even need a card. And you're floating around, and he's going between people to get to his office.
They said he had this little passageway through what was his reception room into what's now the yellow living room, so he wouldn't have to go out in the hall upstairs on the second floor, where job seekers or people would be out there trying to shake the president's hand.
Wasn't it Teddy Roosevelt who had so many children, and he changed that? Didn't
He built the
He
West
really,
Wing.
oh yeah, he didn't have enough bedrooms at the time when Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
I was thinking when you were talking about the athletic activities, I was just reading, because I'm working on Teddy Roosevelt now, he used to take all of the ambassadors and senators on these walks through Rock Creek Park, really tough
Fast.
walks, fast walks. And the rule was whatever you came across, you had to go straight through it. So if you came to a river, you'd have to go through it. So the ambassador from France is there, and he thinks the walk is going to be like the Tuileries. He's got his gloves and his nice outfit, and he's huffing and puffing, and finally they get to a river, and he says, "Thank God it's over." And then Roosevelt says, "Okay, let's undress. We're going to the thing." So he said, "For the honor of France, I took off my clothes." But then he kept his lavender gloves on. And Roosevelt said to him, "Why did you keep your gloves on?" He said, "We might meet ladies on the other side." So you
Well,
were,
speaking
go
of
ahead.
that Roosevelt had all the animals as well, like Mrs. Coolidge did too, that Amity was talking about earlier, with the story that the little boys brought their little pony Algonquin upstairs when Quentin
Right.
was sick or somebody was
Exactly
sick
right.
upstairs.
Exactly right.
Because the animals are also a great comfort to you when you're there,
Definitely.
the pets that you have with
Did
with you in
Millie
the White
really
House.
sleep in between you and your husband?
Are you kidding? Where else would she sleep? We've now got two little people in there. Two little itty-bitty dogs.
Was it fun to write the book about the
Yes.
White House through the perspective of
yes.
Millie?
And I must say the White House photographers really helped me. I mean, we would have a scheduled day to go down to the Red Room, hope nobody saw us, because dogs were not allowed on the furniture, but we placed her beautifully in the green room. She lounged in the Red Room, but the photographers were fabulous about that, helping me, and that was very much fun, and she made over $1 million for charity.
So great.
As George says, I worked all my life, got the highest job maybe in the world, and my dog made more money than
You know, there's a very touching moment when, of course, FDR's dog was Fala, and it was really FDR's dog, but Eleanor then took Fala over. And Fowler was so used to Hail to the Chief that whenever it would be played, when FDR was alive, he would get all excited. And at one point, Eisenhower came to visit Eleanor after FDR was dead. And Fowler was so excited and thinking that FDR was coming back.
Oh,
and it
that's
wasn't.
sad.
So-
Please don't tell stories.
Fortunately, Barney and Beasley never really got
Well,
that excited
I'd
about
like-
LBC.
I'd like to point out that when your photographer talked about the children patting Barney,
Be careful.
good luck.
And didn't one of you had to give diet restrictions? Was that for Ranger, right?
Ranger.
Because everybody's trying to feed Ranger,
And we
right?
we discovered that Ranger had some Juilliard ham or something. He had gone down to the kitchen and the chefs put plates for dinner low. He just went down and helped himself for a while. So George put a thing on him.
So what about Christmas in the White House? That must be a very special.
It's always really fun. We never spent actual Christmas there. That was always at Camp David because by then the parties were over and If you went to Camp David, then the people that are there are posted there with their families. So we would see them in the galley for Christmas dinner, and that way everyone got to stay home or be home for Christmas, all the White House staff and everyone else.
We should mention,
Camp.
looking at Laurie Firestone, that we were so lucky with staff. Laurie worked for me for 12 years. Now, she worked for me, but really she worked for George Bush because he bypassed the chief of staff. Isn't that right? And he would say, Laurie, we're having 40 for dinner tonight for a movie. Can it just be informal? And she would arrange it. I mean, she did wonderful things for us. But also, Susan Porter Rose and the staff, Carol Powers, they were just fabulous. And so I had them for 12 years. I only lost one who got a better salary. But I hear from her. But and they're still with us.
Some people have said that marriages get even stronger because you actually see the guy more than you might, especially in the days when they're campaigning and they're gone, and that a lot of first family marriages have been stronger than at other times. Do you think that's so?
Well, I think just the whole family really gets so close together. You always have an opponent in politics, and so it doesn't have to be your husband.
Oh, come on. Come on. I like you anyway.
So do I, darling.
No, I think there is something about politics when the world isn't against your husband, so you think at times for children. Our grandchildren, 17 plus 4 in-laws, are very close, and I think it's because of politics.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
I mean, they're very close and very loving, and I will say to Pierce, I haven't heard from Marshall for a while. Do you know? Oh, I just talked to her yesterday. Or they get the iPhone, which is evidently you can talk forever for free. But they they know each other. Incidentally, Marshall has just asked me to sign a picture for the Cane Corso dog breeder, and I said, well, what is that? It's a dog about so big that can eat you up. It killed a woman. She's getting one. I signed it, but I didn't want to.
So what do you miss the most about the White House?
Well, I always say the chef.
Understandably.
But I miss, just like Barr said, of course we miss all the people that we worked with, and we see some still a lot. And it's great to see Susan and everybody that's come for this First Ladies Conference. But it's really the people that work there, the butlers and ushers, and all the people that you live with every single day that you miss the most, all the people that work for George and the West Wing.
I've moved 27 different times, and I've learned I don't miss anything. I loved them all, but my life is perfect as it is.
That is so healthy.
Well, nobody ever said I was unhealthy. No, but I really think you can't miss, although she says the chef was nice, but you just go on to other things. And we have been so lucky. All the Bushes have been lucky. Life has been, these libraries and these, whatever center you call your thing. Anyway. I know it's not a library, but the people all come back. We're very lucky, and we know it. And there are people who are hungry, and there are people who are homeless, and people who can't read. And, if you know somebody who's lonely, go see them. There's just a lot of things we can do, because we aren't. We can read. We're certainly well fed. We have lots of people we love. I even love my in-laws. I've got 2 here. Perfect. Look at them. No, we're lucky.
Well, I think nothing could say better when you ask the question, would people run for public office? The experience of both of you and your family and the dignity with which you carried both the offices and the time afterward suggests that it may be a tough vocation, but it may be one of the best vocations in the world. Politics still is and has to be one of the most honorable vocations there are. And we've got to reach a time in this country again when our best people will be able to know what you too have experienced. I know from reading your memoirs, I know from listening to today, I mean, however difficult there might have been moments of time, everything was overshadowed by making a difference, by the excitement of being there and the love of the family being together during it. So I am so glad to have been able to share this with you today. And you're both very much alive. And
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks to everybody. Thank you all so much.